Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. This is the first in a series of 3 programs on HR value and business impact. And in each of these, we're going to be sharing some research findings. We're going to share some methods and tools you can use in your organization. And we're going to share some case examples from HR leaders who've actually lived through them. My name is Jerry Seibert, and I'm with Metrus Group. And joining today is my guest, Steve Ginsberg. Steve, welcome.
Thank you.
Before we get started, just a quick bit of background on Metrus Group, for those of you who might not be familiar with us. So for 30 years, Metrus Group has served as a trusted advisor to business. We're a mix of researchers and practitioners, and we're strong believers in sharing knowledge, with many articles and books published and available through the Metrus Institute, including our 2 most recent books, Hidden Drivers of Success, which dives deep into how you can leverage employee insights for strategic advantage, and Fulfilled, Critical Life Choices, which offers tools to help you on your personal journey, as well as approaches that can help your employees become more mindful, resilient, and engaged in a world that often threatens a lot of stress and burnout all around us. We work with clients from smaller nonprofits to some of the largest corporations in the world, assessing challenges, delivering insights through analytics, and partnering on interventions to impact business results, from executive team alignment to leader and team development to strategy and scorecard refinement. And what we want to talk to you about today is building and communicating HR value. One of our research areas that we've been focused on for a couple of decades now is internal value. How do you achieve it, measure it, and what is its impact? Our largest study in this area included over 1,000 companies and led to some interesting findings. It's probably not too surprising to you that internal service, quality, and value is connected to better business performance. I mean, if you think about it, the service profit chain, where better customer service leads to higher profitability, what we have really shown is that that chain actually continues deeper into the organization, that it doesn't stop with the frontline service personnel. If you consider the impact, for example, of a bad hire, the best case scenario is that your turnover cost is double, meaning that the bad hire leaves quickly and you have to fill the position twice. Worst case is that the hire wreaks havoc on morale or customer satisfaction or quality. And this isn't just an HR issue. I mean, what happens if finance delivers reports with errors or IT deploys systems that don't meet users' needs? But it also works both ways. Stakeholders tell us that when those internal functions are delivering value, then they, the stakeholder groups, see real positive business impacts. They're much more likely to say, when they feel value is being delivered, that those internal functions, HR, IT, whomever, help them, the stakeholders, achieve financial cost savings or better service, improved quality, higher levels of productivity. So you can really get a virtuous cycle going by focusing on internal value delivery. And yet, we have found, looking across many companies and many types of functions, that most departments get less than 60% positive ratings from their stakeholders for overall value delivered. And that is actually an improvement over what we used to see a decade or so ago. And if we went back to the early aughts, a lot of these ratings were 10 or 20 points lower. I think over time there's been a lot of focus on process improvement, CQI, reengineering, and that's had a real impact. But what differentiates departments or functions that are viewed as delivering a high level of value versus a low level of value? We've seen a number of things in our research. I'll just share a couple of them. One is they take the time to talk with their stakeholders and reach an agreement on what counts as success, as delivering value. 2 out of 3 high value delivering departments have mutually agreed on performance metrics with their stakeholders. I mean, they've talked and they've said, this is how we're going to assess whether we're meeting your needs and delivering value. But at most, only about a third of low-value departments do anything similar to that. It also has a lot to do with the consistency of measurement of stakeholder satisfaction. About half of high-value delivering departments are regularly requesting feedback. And I'm not talking about, little pop-up, please rate how the benefits enrollment experience was. I'm talking about more strategic measurement from a variety of stakeholders. On the other hand, only about 1 in 4 low-value departments even ask about this sort of thing. Now, what about specifically for human resources? We've seen some things that really drive the difference in the HR function. One of them is when the HR function has a clear strategy and value proposition. So it's not just that some HR groups do better work than others. They explicitly define and discuss how they can add value amongst themselves and with stakeholders, and then let that drive their strategy as a function. They also figure out what are the best strategic measures that will communicate that value, going beyond the admittedly important operational measures that you need for running HR. For example, as important as time to fill is as a recruitment metric, it's really just an efficiency measure. It doesn't convey business impact to the C-suite the way a quality of hire metric will. Like, are we hiring talent that stays, or better yet, talent that better meets customer needs? The best HR groups also have teams that are not just engaged, but are also highly aligned and highly capable. And finally, they are committed to an ongoing effort to get stakeholder input and ensure that they are having meaningful business impact from the perspective of their stakeholders. So learning all of that, we've built a simple model for building internal value. And it starts with your decisions on why you are doing certain things, the investments that you're choosing to make based on your strategy, the initiatives that you've chosen to pursue and those that you've chosen not to pursue. That, combined with the degree of workforce alignment, capabilities, and engagement within the HR team, are really the foundations. Now, this is the second time that I've mentioned alignment, capabilities, and engagement, so I should probably just explain what that is and why I think it's so important. When I talk about alignment within the team, I'm talking about that line of sight from what people do as individuals to department goals to company goals. I'm talking about alignment with customer needs and expectations. Do people see their department, their function, as having the same priorities, being on the same page as other groups? Capabilities is really, do we have the right people with the right skills, competencies to deliver for our customers, whether they're internal, like HRs, or external? Do we have the information we need when we need it? And do we have the resources and tools that we need? And engagement, I'm sure you're all familiar with. It's not just, am I satisfied with my job? Am I satisfied with the company? But how committed are people? Do they intend to stay? They put out discretionary effort, and ultimately, will they be advocates for the organization? And sometimes people say, well, if you're high on engagement, aren't you likely to be high on these others too? And that's not necessarily the case. You can have a highly engaged team working on the wrong priorities because the strategy hasn't been well thought out or well communicated to them. How important is this? Well, we've actually done research on that across, again, a wide range of functions, including human resources. And when engagement is low in these teams, we find that, in fact, the feedback they get from their stakeholders is also low. On average, 20 to 40% favorable ratings for overall value delivered. When engagement is high, the ratings look quite a bit better. 35 to 60% favorable, as you might expect. But when they're not only high in terms of engagement, but high in terms of alignment and capabilities, those are the groups that we find really tend to blow the doors off the ratings and get the highest levels of feedback from their internal stakeholders. So these two foundations will determine how well you do what you do and how you do it. What you do being those core deliverables, the products and services with which you're impacting the business, and how you do it, meaning really the quality of the relationships. Let me give you an example of what I mean a little more specifically by what you do and how you do it. So what you do, those core deliverables that human resources is responsible for, are the things you would probably naturally think of: the talent acquisition, workforce planning, leader development, succession planning, analytics, and others, right? This is just a partial list. But then in terms of the relationships, how you interact with people, those are, you can think of as service dimensions. So being proactive, being an innovative partner, communicating clearly, going that extra mile when people need you to. And all of these are done ultimately to have business impact in the eyes of the stakeholders. So do they feel what you're doing is ultimately helping with productivity or growth, retention, service quality, risk mitigation, even financial performance? That business impact ultimately is the value that you need to be delivering. So what we have is, in effect, an internal service value chain. But how do you measure effectiveness at building internal value? Well, it depends on who you ask, so to speak. And by that I mean there are different perspectives that you need to consider. In fact, there's at least 3 different perspectives that, from a best practice standpoint, you should really take into consideration. One is getting direct engagement with senior leaders. So by talking to them in a structured interview format, you can gain critical insights from leaders on not just how well you're doing what you need to do, but what should the role of HR be? So some strategic feedback. And what is the value they see you bringing to the business or potentially bringing to the business? And even more importantly, how do they view the future of HR and how will you need to adapt to future challenges? It's also important, I think, to get some broad feedback, reaching out to managers, directors, vice presidents. And that's usually done through a survey because, especially in a bigger organization, you're maybe talking about a lot of people. But asking them a set of questions covering the core deliverables that you are providing to the organization, some of the key service dimensions that are most relevant for your interactions with managers and directors and such. And that allows you to identify variance across units, across functions. So are there some parts of the business that feel they're getting better support than others? Are there differences based on which HRBPs are delivering services? That can provide some definite insights. And the third perspective is really more of an inside looking out perspective. You can actually do a bit of a departmental 360, if you will, by having the HR team answer the same questions that you're asking the stakeholders. And then you can identify, do we have any real blind spots, any gaps where we think we're doing great, but our stakeholders are not so sure? It's also a chance, if you don't have the information through your employee survey, to ask them questions about alignment, capabilities, and engagement, and develop an ACE profile, if you will, for HR. So that's a bit on how to actually measure the value that's being delivered. What I'd like to do now is pull Steve into the conversation and talk a bit about the work that he's done as CHRO. And Steve, I know when you've done this, you've tended to take a very holistic approach, measuring not just HR. Can you describe for a minute the overall approach that you've used and what the goals of that were?
Yes, Jerry, and thank you for your presentation here, because a lot of the things that you presented in that presentation will really line up really well with what I'm going to talk about, at least at the beginning, relative to this question. And very important is that internal value model. So having a strategy that's clear and concise, as well as dealing with the issues of alignment, capabilities, and engagement as a foundation for strategy in HR. That's really how everything began. So early on, we set our HR strategy, and on an annual basis, then plugged in the goals that we wanted to accomplish in each area of alignment, capabilities, and engagement from HR. And one of those things that came up quite early in the process is that we as a company knew a lot about our customers and how they felt about our services. As a very focused customer service company dealing with very specific clients. So we knew a lot about that, but we didn't know very much about how the employees felt about it, as well as how the employees felt about how they were being serviced by other divisions within the company. So this opened the door to a lot of things. So we, in fact, began an organizational assessment process, and after we had set the credibility for that process, then began to engage in the internal value process, and included many other departments besides HR in that internal value search. As far as our view of things, and my biggest must-win battle was in the whole issue of getting the top leaders of the company to continue to invest in people. So, once we set that as a principle, we didn't view our budget as a budget. Our budget was, in fact, a series of investment decisions as to what we were going to do with that money and invest it on an annual basis. And as a result, then, the assessment process of internal value is that return on investment. So doing that was critical to making these investments. And as long as we talked that way, this whole process made a lot of sense to the business folks. So contingent to that, it was important then to make multiple assessments of internal value in any one year, much like our organizational survey, because it got us a whole lot faster to being able to take a look at analyzing this data in regards to business data and beginning to make some conclusions about that. So as a quick example, we were in fact taking a look at training in the area of giving some skill training in the area of providing positive feedback. And when we started to look at our organizational data as well as the data within the company on customer service, we found a very strong relationship between the receipt of positive feedback in the organization and the delivery of higher level customer service. Something that's not earth-shattering from a thought perspective, but we proved it through this assessment process, as well as many other things. Finally, I'd like to say that one of the things we did do that I felt was distinctive was to construct an annual report every year, much like a business report, to report out on what we had achieved with our investments.
It sounds great. Sounds like a very comprehensive program. I think for the sake of our listeners, can you, and in a very practical sense, can you talk about any lessons you learned about what works and what doesn't when you're trying to develop and deploy a program like this?
Well, obviously, the involvement of the executives is critical. So they have to communicate about it and make sure people understood what we were doing. And they have to continue to support, and they have to support not just words, but with actions. So, that was, critical as it is in anything that HR does on an organization-wide basis. Taking a top-down approach in providing feedback once we had results. So with my number of my responsibilities, I had to report on a monthly basis to my boss as to what was occurring, as most leaders of HR do. But in this particular case, he wanted to know before we would have an executive committee meeting what we were going to present and where we were getting with this entire process in the organization. So we took a top-down approach to feedback and then cascaded that from each of the division leaders to the next level of leadership within the organization. And this was all integrated into an existing organizational survey process, as I mentioned before. So it wasn't a one-off, it wasn't special. It continued to be a process of trying to see what our people investments are doing in the organization. Eventually, over time, and worked out extremely well, was to incorporate goals about this information and data into our corporate goals. So actually setting a goal for the kind of measures we wanted to achieve. And then we actually got to executive bonuses being dependent, at least in a small way, upon results achieved through this process. As an organization, we achieved best places to work in the Houston work location 7 years in a row. And so that gave us, awarding that distinction let us know, at least in an external way, that we were doing some good things within the company.
You mentioned taking a top-down approach with sharing the results. In a program like this, you can have a lot of data, a lot of numbers. When it came to communicating the results, what was most effective, and how did you convey the key metrics, or even choose the key metrics to communicate to the senior leadership team?
Well, metrics were a very important part of really communicating the strategy from an HR perspective. And I started that very early on, and we started collecting data on all of our initiatives within HR, as well as business data. And we began to post them on a wall in HR. We decided not to invest in complicated electronics, that a few magnetic strips were all that we needed to be flexible enough to continue to update our metrics as we went along on paper. And as time grew on, my team developed their metrics based on their goals as it related to this particular assessment, as well as other things that we were doing. So, as time grew over, as this program grew over time, my employees actually got into having some fun with it and actually put up a big sign over the wall that said the Great Wall of Metrics. So that every year we continue to update that Great Wall. So it was important to us to kind of highlight it. And what we actually found is we had business people coming in from other departments looking at our wall of metrics, very interested in what was going on in HR, as well as finding out some of the things from the business.
How did you ensure impact, business impact, and a commitment to using the results for taking action? As I've seen in a lot of organizations, various data collection and reporting activities, often done very well, but sometimes done very well and yet not then utilized effectively. So how did you make sure that part of the process happened?
Well, members of my team were designated responsibilities for different departments and took the information from these assessments. Once, of course, the senior executive had been communicated to, and usually we sat through the session with the senior executive and their next level of leaders through that process. But the important question always to ask at that point in time is the question you're asking me. What are we going to do with this? And if there was an agreement on doing things with it, then we were going to set goals to, in fact, continue to monitor over time to see where we were going. And since we were continuing to evaluate over time and assess over time, that we would always be looking at these things to see if we had accomplished it at a level we wanted to, based on the assessments, and then what other new things we might want to go on to. So I think an active participating role of HR in the process, using performance management processes and tools, are very critical to all of this. And then, if you've got rewards tied into this, and if you've got these things tied up in company goals, and it's really making a difference from a customer perspective, then you're doing well.
So programs like this, I think, can sort of fade into the background fairly easily, especially if you're doing fairly well on a lot of the metrics. How did you make sure that this stayed fresh and relevant for the organization?
Well, the program itself had a lot of visibility because the CEO was quite interested in it, and because we made it visible, we kept it at a visible level. It appeared in executive committee sessions. And then, once you've also got meaningful kinds of outcomes for leaders in the organization relative to these kinds of things, that seems to be a constant rejuvenator of the process. In addition, though, I wanted to make sure that by the time I left the organization, there were other people who could keep the process going. So I actively got other members of my team and actually some volunteers from other areas to ensure that the process would continue on. So it wasn't just me kind of leading it all the time. It was other people leading it who had rejuvenated enthusiasm or initial enthusiasm to keep the program going. So you really wanted to sew it into the fabric of the culture as well as the organization.
All right. Well, any other lessons learned or anything I didn't ask you about that you think would be helpful for people who might be considering ways to improve how they measure or communicate HR value?
Sure. I think it's important to limit the number of questions. So I think in our case, many times our internal value assessments maybe had no more than about 8 to 10 questions. Whereas our organizational assessment, usually it was kept down to a number less than 30. So I think that's important. So you're not trying to focus on everything in all of this. And so that for me was important. In addition, we were also going for best places to work. We were doing multiple surveys a year, although any one employee would only fill out one of those surveys in a year. We wanted to ensure that we didn't confuse people with all these different surveys. And so it's important for the senior leaders to communicate what survey was happening at the time and to keep reminding people to fill out that survey because it was important for corporate goals or it was important for the possibility of being awarded a Best Places to Work distinction.
All right. Well, Steve, we're just about out of time, so thank you again for taking the time to join me this afternoon. And I would just like to mention to everyone that we do have 2 more programs coming up in this series. January 18th, my guest will be Stephen Battaglia, former CHRO for Total Wine and for Nestle SA. And we'll be talking about what works and what doesn't with outsourcing. Stephen will share a unique case that combines outsourcing, insourcing, and shared services. So I'm looking forward to that discussion. And then on February 8th, Alan Weisberg, former CHRO for Ethicon and Chief Learning Officer at Johnson & Johnson, will join me for a look at onboarding, leader development, and succession planning, with some special attention on what to do when that executive you hire has, and you spent so long finding, is now struggling once they've gotten on board. If any of our attendees has questions for myself or for Steve, I've got our email addresses up on the screen now. Please don't hesitate to reach out, and we'll be happy to get back to you as quickly as possible with answers. All right. Thank you, everybody, and that concludes our webinar for today.